What happens when a hardworking man is denied a loan because of who he is? Watch how James Carter fights back, sparking a movement that changes his community forever. Stay tuned for a story of resilience, unity, and justice that'll leave you inspired. A prejudiced banker denies a loan to a black man, despite his meeting all the loan criteria. The banker faces consequences the next day when he sees the man in the news. James Carter stood outside the towering bank, taking a deep breath. The glass building loomed large, its reflective windows mirroring the bustling city. He adjusted his tie, squared his shoulders, and stepped through the grand revolving door. Inside, the bank was imposing, with polished floors, high ceilings, and a faint scent of polish lingering. James approached the reception desk, where a sharply dressed woman greeted him with a polished smile.
At 8:27 a.m., James Carter rolled into the nearly deserted courthouse parking lot, the old brick building looming like a relic from the 70s, untouched by time. The spring air was crisp, tinged with the promise of heat, carrying whispers of fresh-cut grass and something heavier, dust, or perhaps the stale fear that clung to places like this. He lingered in his battered Ford pickup, engine ticking as it cooled, hand steady on the wheel, eyes locked on the courthouse through the windshield. It should have been a routine morning, a quick stop to fight a parking ticket that never should have been written. He glanced at the envelope beside him, stuffed with the citation and photos proving the handicap sign had been torn from the pavement weeks ago. Anyone could see it, but the officer who wrote the ticket either didn't care or chose to ignore it. James could have paid the fine and walked away. But something gnawed at him, not the cost, but the principle. More than that, it was the officer's smirk, the look that said James was just another black man dodging rules in a system that never forgets a face. He exhaled, grabbed the door handle, and stepped out, gravel crunching under his boots. In a navy windbreaker and crisp jeans, he looked like any working man on a day off, but his stride carried something deeper: discipline, restraint, honed from years of navigating spaces where being black meant being scrutinized, judged, dismissed before a word was uttered. Crossing the lot toward the courthouse doors, he passed a small group spilling out, voices hushed, papers clutched tight, shoes scraping concrete in the weary rhythm of bureaucracy. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow over scuffed tiles and beige walls. A clock ticked above the security desk. James nodded to the deputy at the entrance, then moved down the hallway, lined with folding chairs and bulletin boards, sagging under faded notices. The courtroom waited on the second floor. As he climbed the stairs, his grandfather's words echoed. "The worst lie isn't what they tell you. It's what you tell yourself to keep the peace." Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with the scent of old paper and floor polish, the benches creaking under restless bodies, less a hall of justice than a waiting room for judgment. James took a seat near the middle, pulling out his envelope, settling in without a word. The judge hadn't arrived, but a cluster of officers stood by the wall, their low laughter cutting through the hum. James ignored them until a familiar voice sliced through. "Look who bothered to show up," Officer Daniel Brooks sneered, his tone dripping with mockery. "Took some guts, huh?" His voice wasn't loud, but it carried, meant to draw eyes. James turned slowly, locking eyes with Brooks, and said, "Just here to set things right." His voice was calm, unshaken. Brooks chuckled, leaning closer. "Don't waste your breath. Judges here don't care for excuses, especially from folks like you." James's jaw tightened, but he held steady, turning back to his seat, fingers brushing the envelope. A young woman 2 rows back shifted, her eyes darting between them. The air grew hotter, pressing against his chest, but James breathed slow, steady, knowing this wasn't the moment to strike back. It was the moment to remember. The clerk called the court to order minutes later, and the room rose as Judge Margaret Ellison swept in, silver hair gleaming, face a mask of indifference. Her eyes didn't meet the crowd. They sliced through it, scanning for trouble before it could spark. Cases churned quickly. Speeding tickets, property disputes, unpaid fines. Some got a patient ear, others a swift dismissal. James watched, noting the rhythm, the judge's glances to the bailiff, the way voices hushed when certain names were called. He knew patterns, and this place had one, whether it admitted it or not. When his name rang out, James rose, adjusting his jacket, and walked to the front, every eye trailing him. The envelope felt like a weapon in his hand, heavier than paper should be. As he reached the bench, he caught Brooks's smirk from the corner of his eye, arms crossed, waiting for the show. James didn't give him the satisfaction. His focus was razor sharp, locked on what he'd come to do, and on the growing fire in his gut that this morning was about to become something none of them expected. James stood firm at the courtroom's heart, envelope clutched tight, facing Judge Ellison as she peered over her glasses, her face a blank wall of authority. Neither warm nor cruel, just distant, as if she'd already decided his worth. Behind her, faded portraits of old judges glared down, their stern eyes guarding a legacy that asked no questions of itself. The fluorescent lights droned above, and the shuffle of papers and creaking benches wove a tense, underwater rhythm. Before James could speak, Officer Brooks strode forward from the wall, his voice bold, cutting through the quiet. "Your Honor, let me shed light on this incident," he said, his tone too smooth, too practiced. The judge nodded once, a flick of her wrist granting him the floor, as if this were just another day. Brooks sauntered to the witness box with a swagger that screamed he'd played this game before and always won. James stood still, his face a mask, though every muscle coiled, not with fear, but with the sharp instinct of a man who knew a lie was about to take shape. The vehicle was parked in a handicapped zone, no tags, no markings, Brooks began, his voice slick as oil. When I approached, the driver was hostile, uncooperative. I asked for ID twice. He resisted. He paused, then added, "Honestly, I felt threatened." The words landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading through the room, heavy with intent. James didn't flinch, didn't shift. His thoughts churned, not with shock, but with the bitter familiarity of being rewritten, his story twisted into someone else's script. He exhaled slowly, silently, and waited. The judge turned to him. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice flat. "Is that what happened?" "No, Your Honor," James replied, his tone steady as stone. "I offered my ID immediately, stayed calm throughout. I have photos proving the sign was missing." He lifted the envelope slightly, his movements precise, respectful. "The spot wasn't marked, and I was there 5 minutes to pick up a prescription." The judge gave a curt nod, her eyes unmoved, cold as glass. "Approach and submit your evidence," she said, her voice void of warmth or curiosity. James stepped forward, placed the envelope on the bench, and returned to his place, hands clasped, shoulders squared, his calm a shield against the room's weight. Brooks stood smug, arms crossed, one eyebrow cocked as if amused. He leaned toward the judge, voice low but sharp. "Your Honor, I've written hundreds of tickets. I know when someone's dodging accountability." The words weren't loud, but they cut, carrying the familiar sting of assumption. A faint gasp came from behind James, maybe the woman in the back row, but it echoed in his ears like a whisper of solidarity too scared to shout. James kept his gaze on the judge. "I'm not here to waste time," he said quietly. "I believe this fine was a mistake, and I'm here to correct it." The judge's lips pressed thin, her expression teetering between annoyance and apathy. "You'll be notified of the court's ruling by mail," she said, voice sharp as a blade. "You're dismissed." James lingered a moment, not in defiance, but because the moment felt too heavy to rush. Then he turned, walking back to his seat as Brooks stepped away, still smirking. As they passed, Brooks muttered, "Some folks think they're above the rules." James's hands curled briefly, but he didn't respond, didn't look back. It wasn't anger, not the kind that explodes. It was deeper, colder, a weight that settled in his chest and wouldn't leave. The gavel cracked like a whip, its echo hanging in the air like a warning shot. Judge Ellison straightened, her eyes narrowing as she fixed them on James, who stood unwavering, hands steady, posture forged in quiet defiance. The room, once alive with murmurs and shifting feet, froze, as if the air itself held its breath. "You were late, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice sharp, slicing through the silence. "Do you think this court's time is less valuable than yours?" Her words cut deep, precise, the kind of tone that drew no blood but left a mark all the same. James blinked slowly, deliberately, and answered, "No, Your Honor." "I was here before the docket started and waited quietly until called." His voice was calm, unshaken, a steady anchor in a storm. She didn't acknowledge his words. Instead, she leaned forward, hands clasped tightly atop the bench, her tone heavy with authority. "This court demands punctuality and respect," she declared. "Fail to show either, and you face consequences. For violating lawful signage and displaying what I deem contempt, you're fined $1,200. No gasps broke the silence, only the faint hum of the air conditioner and the creak of a bench behind him. James's pulse slowed, then spiked, not from shock, but from the deep ache of injustice delivered so casually, as if his voice, his evidence, his presence had never mattered. He didn't speak at first. The weight of the moment choked his words. It was the kind of injustice that didn't shout. It whispered, cloaked in routine, and that made it heavier. At last, he looked up. "Your Honor, may I ask if the fine is for the citation alone, or for something I said today?" His voice was calm, measured, a question wrapped in respect. The judge's eyes flicked past him, briefly to Brooks, then back, her lips tightening. "Consider this a lesson in how this court works, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice cold as stone. James's jaw clenched, a faint tremor of restraint. He nodded once, not in surrender, but in understanding, seeing the truth of what he'd walked into. The clerk typed on. The bailiff glanced at his clipboard, and someone coughed softly in the back. James returned to his seat, moving with the care of a man holding something fragile. His composure, maybe, or the last thread of faith in the system. He tucked the envelope away and pulled out a small legal pad, his pen moving with quiet precision, each stroke a brick in a foundation he was only beginning to build. He'd seen this before, different towns, different faces, but the same script, a subtle dismissal, a harsher ruling, fairness eroded under the guise of protocol. Behind him, a woman whispered to her daughter about the wait, and someone sighed, heavy with resignation. The judge called the next case, her tone unchanged, as if nothing had shifted, as if James's moment had been a blip in an endless day. But for him, everything had changed. The courtroom wasn't just a room anymore, it was a battlefield, and he'd only just drawn his first line. James stayed seated, his body still as stone, his mind racing like a storm gathering strength. The judge's voice faded into a dull hum, drowned out by the fire in his thoughts, each one sharp, disciplined, ready to strike. He'd seen courtrooms like this before, federal halls, small-town hearings, polished city chambers. But the rules were always the same, unwritten but ironclad. He thought about walking out, letting the moment fade into another scar on a long list. But something stopped him. Not pride, not even justice. but a deeper instinct, a refusal to let Brooks's smirk or the judge's dismissal be the final word. "Excuse me," a soft voice broke through from behind. He turned to see the young woman from earlier, mid-20s, clutching a worn notebook, her eyes bright with nerve. "I hope I'm not out of line, but that wasn't right," she said, her voice low but steady, unbowed by the room's weight. James gave a small nod, careful not to draw eyes. Her words landed like a spark in dry grass, small but enough to catch. He turned back, hands clasped, the knot in his gut tightening, not with anger, but with purpose taking root. He'd come to fix a ticket. Now he was staring down a system that thrived on silencing people like him, and he wasn't about to let it slide. From the wall, Brooks lounged, arms crossed, his smirk a silent taunt, as if James were just another case to close. James met his gaze for a moment, then let it go. Not out of weakness, but because some fights needed more than a stare. He pulled out his pen, opened his notebook, and wrote. Not as a defendant, but as a witness. He captured the judge's words, the docket's rhythm, the uneven treatment of latecomers. He wasn't building a complaint. He was forging evidence. And evidence, when wielded right, could break walls. The courtroom doors creaked as a man in a gray blazer slipped in late, nodding to the bailiff, taking a seat without a ripple of consequence. James noted the time. 9:52 a.m. The judge didn't look up. The storm that had crashed on James for a few minutes' delay never touched this man. The double standard wasn't just clear, it was alive, breathing in every ruling. A young black man in the back stood, shaking his head, and walked out, his eyes meeting James's for a fleeting moment. Silent, certain, a shared understanding of what they'd both seen. James leaned back, exhaling, letting the moment sink deep. This wasn't about a ticket anymore. It was about the quiet machinery of bias, how it built itself, brick by unseen brick, into something that looked like order but felt like a cage. And James, trained to see what others missed, had just found the crack he needed to start pulling it apart. James lingered until the courtroom emptied, the hum of cases fading to a whisper, the air thick with the weight of what had passed. The morning session wound down, but the tension clung to the walls like damp heat. He stayed in his seat, letting the silence settle, letting the room breathe its secrets. Then, as only a few stragglers remained, shuffling papers, grabbing coats, he rose with quiet intent and strode toward the front. The clerk looked up, her fingers freezing mid-keystroke, a flicker of worry in her eyes. Judge Ellison, still at the bench, flipped through papers, her face tired but guarded, as if the robe itself shielded her from scrutiny. James stopped short of the railing, waiting until her eyes met his, then spoke with a voice that cut through the quiet, steady and deliberate. "Your Honor," he said, each word measured. "Before I go, I think it's time I properly introduce myself." Judge Ellison paused, her expression still, but her focus sharpening. "The session is over, Mr. Carter," she said, her tone formal, edged with impatience. "Further business goes through the court administrator." James nodded slowly, then reached into his coat, pulling out a small black wallet, the kind that carried authority, not cash. He flipped it open, letting the badge and ID catch the light. "I understand," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. "But I'm James Carter, senior investigator with the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice." The words didn't boom, they burned, shifting the air like a spark in a dry field. The clerk's hand stilled. The bailiff straightened, eyes narrowing. Judge Ellison blinked, not in shock, but as if recalculating every moment of the morning. The silence crackled, alive with unspoken questions. James pressed on, his tone steady, deliberate. "I was late today because of an urgent federal case on human trafficking," he said. "I didn't mention it earlier. I don't use my title to sidestep process. But I do believe in fairness. And what I saw here today raises serious red flags." The silence grew heavy, electric. Judge Ellison's eyes held his, her composure intact but fraying at the edges. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice slower now, "if you believe there's been a procedural issue, file a complaint with the State Judicial Board." "I'm already documenting," James replied, lifting his notebook slightly. "But this isn't just about me. It's about the pattern. Unequal treatment of late arrivals. No review of evidence. Punishment without question." The judge's jaw tightened, her hands clasping harder, betraying tension she couldn't hide. "This court values fairness," she said, but the words sounded hollow, like a script read too many times. "I know," James said, his voice a quiet blade. "And I'm here to make sure everyone in power respects it." He nodded once, tucked the badge away, and turned to leave, his footsteps echoing in a room that suddenly felt too small. As he walked out, he felt the weight of eyes, not accusing, but watching, aware that something had shifted. The clerk's typing resumed, softer now, as if afraid to disturb the moment. A young law student by the door lowered her notebook, her eyes wide with something like awe. Outside, the hallway felt sharper, the fog lifted, the light hitting the tiles like a promise. James had walked in to fight a ticket. Now he was carrying something bigger, a truth that refused to stay buried. James stepped from the courthouse into the blazing midday sun, its heat peeling back shadows, exposing everything in its glare. The air pressed warm against his skin, laced with blooming spring and the faint grit of old pavement. He crossed the lot slowly, his boots thumping softly, his mind racing, piecing together the morning's wait and what it demanded next. Inside his truck, he shut the door, the silence wrapping him like a held breath. The courthouse loomed behind, its routine unchanged, but he was no longer part of its rhythm. He pulled out his phone, opened a secure folder, and typed with swift precision, "Filing report." Suspected courtroom bias, racial disparities, hostile tone. Full documentation to follow. The message went to his assistant at the DOJ field office, where systems were ready for moments like this. To the room he'd left behind, he was just a man with a ticket. They didn't know they'd just crossed a federal civil rights investigator with a memory as long as his mandate. He slid the phone back into his coat, catching the clerk's glance from the courthouse window. Brief, hesitant, maybe an unspoken apology. He filed it away. Silent allies often emerged when the moment demanded. Outside, the wind kicked up, shaking the trees lining the courthouse lawn, their shadows dancing like warnings across the ground. James leaned forward, elbows on his knees, studying the bench where Ellison sat. Her posture seemed stiffer now, as if she sensed the tide turning. He wondered if she knew who he was. He wondered if it mattered. From his briefcase, he pulled a thin folder. Not evidence, but power. His credentials, agency ID, case files he oversaw. He stared at it, then closed it. Not yet. Timing was everything, and right now he needed to watch, let the system reveal itself. It always did. The courtroom doors creaked as a latecomer in a gray blazer slipped in, unhurried, unpunished. James noted the time, 9:52 a.m. The judge didn't blink. The disparity wasn't subtle. It was blatant, a rule bent for some and ironclad for others. James exhaled, letting the moment settle, feeling purpose take shape. This wasn't about his fine anymore. It was about a system that thrived on selective blindness, and he was done letting it hide. Back at his office, the light cut sharper through the windows, and his desk became a war room. Papers, case files, a battlefield of truth. He opened his DOJ laptop, logged into the secure system, and began drafting the memorandum. Annotated notes, time-stamped photos, transcript excerpts, cross-referenced rulings from the past year. Each click built a clearer picture, one no one could dismiss. The email's subject line stared back at him. Urgent. Discriminatory practices. Lincoln County Court. He hit send, exhaling not from relief, but from momentum. The fight was on. His phone rang at 7:36 a.m. the next morning, Sarah Thompson's name flashing on the screen. "I read your report," she said, her voice sharp. "This isn't just a bad day, it's systemic." "I know," James replied, "and I don't think it's Ellison's first time." Sarah paused. "We need to play this smart but hard. I'm alerting the Judicial Review Commission and assigning a team. Get everything. Statements, case comparisons, anything that proves pattern over fluke." "On it," James said, already listing names. Attorneys, clerks, community voices who'd seen this before. That afternoon, Emma, a junior analyst, rushed in with a tablet. "This just dropped," she said, showing a blog post titled, "When Justice Looks Away, a Morning in Lincoln Court." A law student's raw account of James's stand, now shared thousands of times. He read the final line. "I watched a man stand up when everything screamed to sit down. That's the courage I want to carry." James leaned back, a quiet smile breaking through. The story wasn't his anymore. It was alive, moving on its own. By week's end, James sat in a packed library meeting room, the air heavy with unspoken stories. Residents, students, defenders, and clergy filled the creaking chairs, their voices rising. Raw, real, ready. A woman shared her $800 taillight fine, her receipts ignored. An older man spoke of a judge who never looked up from his name. James listened, his pen moving, capturing not just facts, but pain, truth, the weight of being unseen. Elena Martinez, the clerk, approached him later, her hands trembling as she handed over a notebook. "I've been writing it down, cases, comments, moments that felt wrong," she said. James took it with care, nodding. "You've done enough," he said. "I'll handle it from here." Her nervous smile flickered, a spark of defiance breaking through. The next day, James returned to the courthouse, silent in the gallery, watching the patterns unfold. A black defendant fined $300 for parking, a white one warned, a Latina's plea dismissed, while a white man got leniency. He logged it all, timestamps, codes, proof. That night, an email arrived, no subject, from a woman in court that day. "I saw you stand up. Thank you." Attached was a video, shaky but clear, capturing his badge reveal, the judge's pause, the room's shift. James saved it, his heart steady but heavy. The truth was growing legs, and he was no longer alone. The story broke wide by Monday, seeping into local news like fire through dry grass. James laced his shoes as the TV flashed courthouse footage, a voiceover noting, "Allegations of bias spark DOJ inquiry." His name wasn't out, not yet, but the words were, spreading fast. At the hotel cafe, people scrolled headlines, their eyes lingering on Judge Ellison's photo. James grabbed his coffee and stepped into the wind, the town unchanged, but humming with new energy. Sarah called, her voice electric. "Your report's a bombshell. The commission's moving in. Media's not letting go. You ready for the spotlight?" "I've been ready," James said, his voice a quiet vow. That afternoon, in a diner booth, paper spread like a battle plan. A man approached with a worn envelope. "Same thing happened to me," he said, handing over his story. James nodded. "We need every voice." By day's end, dozens had come forward. Emails, letters, videos, each a crack in the system's armor. A woman shared her story on a podcast. A man posted a video, raw with emotion, about his son's humiliation in court. James walked the streets that night, the glow of storefronts reflecting off wet pavement, the courthouse dark, but no longer silent. The reporter's voicemail waited. "We want your side, Mr. Carter." But he wasn't ready for cameras. This needed evidence, not headlines. At midnight, Elena texted, "They're asking questions at the office." I said nothing. James replied, "Stay steady." The silence was breaking, and he was leading it, one truth at a time. A week later, the courthouse felt alive, its rhythm off-kilter. Clerks whispered, judges hesitated, Brooks vanished. On leave, they said. But James knew better. The system was turning on itself. In a community meeting, voices rose, raw, unfiltered, demanding to be heard. James listened, his presence a quiet anchor. "I believe you," he said, and the room stilled, shoulders lifting, pen scratching. He spoke of bias hidden in routine, of voices silenced by assumption, of a system that looked fair, but crushed some harder than others. Elena handed him an envelope, old memos, clerk notes, emails never meant to see light. "It's about time," she said. James took it, knowing the risk she'd taken. That night, rain drumming the window, he filed each piece, building a case that couldn't be ignored. Media swarmed the courthouse by noon, cameras, headlines, questions. "DOJ official sparks bias probe," they wrote. James stayed in the shadows, meeting advocates, clergy, residents, collecting stories like bricks for a new foundation. A woman's podcast went viral, a man's video hit thousands of views, and the pressure grew. Motions filed, training proposed, change demanded. At a town hall, an elderly man gripped James's hand. 40 years I've seen this courthouse break people," he said. "You made it listen." James embraced him, whispering, "We make sure it never forgets." In his office, he pinned the voided $1,200 fine to the wall, a reminder, not a trophy, beside a rally photo, fists raised, signs bold. Accountability is justice. The story wasn't his anymore. It was theirs. 3 months later, James walked back into the courthouse, not to fight, but to speak. The floors creaked, the walls still beige, but banners for equity hung high, signs in 4 languages offering aid. The new judge, sharp-eyed and open, shook his hand. "I've read your work," she said. The courtroom, now a forum, brimmed with voices, attorneys, students, former defendants, all united. At the podium, James's voice was soft, but unshakable. "Justice doesn't start here," he said. "It starts with how we see each other before these doors open." The room hung on his words, not for drama, but for their quiet power. Sometimes one moment, one case, shows us how far we've strayed. After, a student asked, "Is this change real?" James smiled. "It's slow, but it's deep." Outside, spring bloomed, the courthouse steps alive with new voices. He paused, looking back, feeling the weight lift, not gone, but shared. The silence was gone. The truth was loud. This story isn't just about one man or one fine. It's about the quiet theft of fairness and the courage to call it out. James Carter didn't shout, but he made the system hear. His stand reminds us, justice isn't given, it's demanded. If this moved you, share it. Like comment, pass it on to someone who believes in what's right. Subscribe for more stories that demand truth and ignite change. Your voice keeps this fire burning.